into three parts. The first part will be looking at the origins of the sociology of race within sociological theory itself. The second part will look at the sociology of race as a standalone theory in sociology. And then the third part will be giving you my critique and conclusions regarding the nature of race and race relations in the Western world. So, and then we'll leave it for questions and answers. I should be about an hour 15 minutes. I hope I'd rather have this in dialogue form so we can have a fruitful conversation afterwards. So I'll try not to be long-winded, and hopefully you all will get a gist. And I'll incorporate the essays that I had you all read into the final analysis of my lecture. There are four theoretical framework or paradigms in sociology. The first, which we associate with Max Weber, as well as George Simmel, George Herbert Mead, which we call symbolic interactionism. Now, symbolic interactionism looks at sociological phenomenon at the micro level. So we're looking at how the individual or the social actor utilize symbols to interact and construct meaning in social interaction. So that's at the micro level. Then you have structural functionalism, which we associate with Emile Durkheim, Dr. Parsons in the US, and variants of structural functionalism, which we associate with some elements of the Frankfurt School. And what structural functionalism attempts to do is look at sociological phenomenon at the macro level. So we're looking at how social institutions are in place to constitute society as a whole, and the whole aim of the structural functionalist is to look at society as a functioning whole, constituted by institutions and social actors operating through these institutions to find equilibrium in the society. There's also aspects of structural functionalism which can be associated with dysfunction in the society as well. But the dysfunction serves to constitute society as a functioning whole. And the third paradigm in sociology looks at conflict theory. And we trace this part of the sociological imagination with Karl Marx, who looked at society as being constituted based on the political economy of the society and the conflicts that would emerge out of the political, economic, material structure of society. So because the emphasis for Marx is on the political economy as the fundamental basis upon which society is constituted, the overarching conflict upon which society is constituted is class. So you have symbolic interactionism at the micro level, and the other two focus on the constitution of society at the macro level. So structural functionalism and conflict theory is looking at society at the macro level and how such society is constituted on those two levels. There's a fourth school that comes out of the 1980s, a fourth paradigm in the sociological imagination, which we call structurationist theory, which builds on the structuration theory of Anthony Giddens. And in that school of thought, we have Pierre Bourdieu out of France. We have Jürgen Habermas out of the Frankfurt School. You have Marshall Solins out of the Chicago School. You also have, again, Anthony Giddens. And The sole emphasis in structuration theory is to somehow synthesize the macro symbolic interactionism, which the critique of symbolic interactionism, it excused the macro component upon which society is constituted, and the macro. So structurationism attempts to synthesize the symbolic interactionism of symbolic interactionism of the symbolic interactionist school with the conflict and structural functionalism of structural functionalism and conflict theory. And I come out of that tradition, that structurationist tradition, as you will see later on down the line of this lecture. Now, the sociology of race and with structurationism, so structurationism emphasizes duality. It emphasizes how, yes, there are macro structures that constitute society, and we as social actors internalize these the ideas, ideals, and values upon which these social institutions and structures are constituted, and we recursively organize them and reproduce them in our material praxis, in our everyday praxis. So the attempt is how we as social actors use the ideas, ideals, and values of social institutions, which we recursively reproduce in our social interactions as well as in our everyday praxis. So the attempt in structurationism is to take symbolic interactionism and synthesize it with structural functionalism as well as Marxian conflict theory. The sociology of race, the foundation of the sociology of race is based on the Marxian notion of conflict theory. And then in that, the emphasis is looking at race as the basis upon which a particular society is constituted. And the founding fathers, which we assert, the founding father of the sociology of race, which we associate in this sociological imagination with the sociology of race, is W.E.B. Du Bois, or some people say Du Bois, but because he was a French heritage from the island of Haiti, I say Du Bois, but most Americans say Du Bois. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois attempts to use, whether it's directly or indirectly, attempt to use racial conflict theory to understand the constitution of society based on race relations and racial interaction between a dominant group, a dominant racial group, and a subordinate racial group. Now, at the time when Du Bois is writing, race was viewed as a immutable biological construct. So if you were placed in a racial category, the praxis and the ideas, and values associated with your race were viewed to be biological and immutable. So therefore, if you were considered Black in America, for example, there was the one drop rule, and that meant if you had one drop of Black blood, you were Black, and your praxis represented the praxis of this quote unquote racial group called Black, and you recursively organize and reproduce these practices in your everyday life. These were biologically determined, they were immutable, and you could not get out of this social category called Black, no matter how hard you tried. W.E.B. Du Bois would introduce race as a social construct upon which society determined these characteristics, which for a long time were considered biological and immutable. So therefore, the characteristics themselves were not biological and immutable. They were social constructs in which the power elites of the society determined as categories upon which to classify certain individuals as either being Black or white. So when we look at the sociology of race, there are four components that we want to focus on. We want to focus on, well, W.E.B. Du Bois focuses on four components. And overall, we would focus on these four components. Number one would be racial identity. How does the dominant group categorize and classify certain individuals? Now, Du Bois's famous construct based on racial identity would be his double consciousness construct, which he develops in a paper called Conservation of Races. And that paper would in turn be published as a book in 1903 called The Souls of Black Folk. And in that book, Du Bois focuses on what he calls the double consciousness of the American Negro. Now, by double consciousness, the debate Du Bois intended to emphasize double consciousness as a bifurcated consciousness which develops among groups, racial groups who are subjugated in the society. So their notion of self becomes basically bifurcated. On the one hand, the Negro is considered an African with these constructs which are deemed biological and immutable, and prevents them from being Americans. So what developed is this double consciousness, like a schizophrenia. There's the same concept in gender study, we just call it bifurcated consciousness in gender study. Now, the problem with that is because at the time when Du Bois is writing at the turn of the 20th century, in which he's still on the one hand, and this is Kwame Appiah points this out. On the one hand, Du Bois wants to hold on to race as a biological construct while simultaneously holding on racial identity as being a social constructivist construct. So the debate in the sociology of race, is the Black person an African, or is he American, or is he both? If Du Bois is emphasizing the social constructivist nature of the double consciousness of the Black American, he cannot emphasize that he's both, because what would dominate when it came to Black racial identity at the turn of the 20th century, the two dominant theories that would dominate the sociology of race would be what's called the pathological pathogenic theory and what's called the adaptive vitality theory of racial identity when it pertains to Blacks. So what does the pathological pathogenic theory say? The pathological pathogenic theory argues, and some will argue, that Du Bois is trying to refute both positions with his double consciousness construct when it comes to racial identity. The pathological pathogenic theory argues that Black racial identity, there is no such thing as a Black racial identity. The Black American is nothing but an American and nothing else. But slavery destroyed the African cultural heritage of Black people, whether it's in the Caribbean, whether it's on the American continent, wherever they were in the diaspora. Slavery eradicated the culture because of slavery. To use the term, slavery was a total institution that prevented Black folks from recursively reorganizing or reproducing anything that was African about them. So therefore, the Black American was nothing but an American. In response to the pathological pathogenic theory, the adaptive vitality theory argues no, that is not the case. Slavery did not prevent Black folk from recursively reorganizing or reproducing the cultural heritage in the diaspora. On the contrary, they maintained many of these, they maintained their African cultural heritage and what's known in the literature as Africanisms. So Africanisms allow Blacks in the diaspora to maintain their cultural heritage. It is within those two theoretical paradigms within the sociology of race that Du Bois would develop his double consciousness construct. So Du Bois is trying to say, on the one hand, the Black American is both an American and an African, but he can only do so if he maintains the notion of race as being biological and immutable. If he does not, we will see the problematic with that, because everything I'm discussing now will impact how later theorists will conceptualize Black racial identity within the sociology of race. So keep this in mind as we proceed. So Du Bois's double consciousness construct is an attempt to resolve these two racial dynamics. So he's competing against sociologists such as E. Franklin Frazier, also anthropologists such as Margaret Mead and the American Anthropological School, who hold on to Herskovits, Melville Herskovits, who developed this notion of adaptive vitality and this whole notion of Africanism. And these two theoretical paradigms would clash when it comes to trying to understand racial identity within the sociology of race. The second component of sociology of race is what we call racial formation. Now, this concept comes out of the work of Howard Omni and another sociologist, Granite. They come up with this concept called racial formation. Racial formation within the sociology of race want to understand how is it that what are the social, political, and economic processes that help constitute race as a category upon which society is constituted. And Omni and Wynant will develop this theory from Du Bois. This is a direct connection to Du Bois, because what Du Bois will argue in his work, such as the Philadelphia Negro, for example, which is a sociological classic, what he argues is that not only is race a social construct, but there are economic and political aspects involved in using race to constitute a society based on racial identity. So there are social, political, and economic processes in place to prevent Blacks from assimilating into society and being American. So we call that component of the sociology of race, sociological racial formations. These are social, political, and economic processes that are in place to prevent Blacks from exercising their racial identity in the society. The third component of the sociology of race is what we call racial politics. Now, by racial politics, what Du Bois and others are trying to emphasize, what are the political constructs that would emerge out of the formation of racial identity upon which society is constituted? Do you have, for example, one of these racial political elements could be Black nationalism, Black assimilationism, Black segregationism, or Black genocide as the means by which racial politics are exercised within any society based on race and race relations. Now, Du Bois, and many people have a problem, and I have, this is my particular problem with W.E.B. Du Bois, he would vacillate on the racial politics of Black folk throughout his career. So, for example, he would attack Black nationalism as the correct form that Black racial politics should assume in society. Where his biggest nemesis when it came to Black nationalism was Marcus Isaiah Garvey, in which Garvey was promoting Black nationalism in a return back to Africa movement to try to get the. For Garvey, for Marcus, and let's give you a short background on Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was actually from the island of Jamaica, And he moved to Harlem in the early 1900s when W.E.B. Du Bois was making his name known in the upper echelon of American society. And what Marcus Garvey argued was that Blacks could never integrate and assimilate in white society, whether it's in Jamaica, whether it's in the diaspora, or in America, especially in America, given how impactful racial discrimination and racial prejudice and the lynching of Black folk, which was a genocidal movement of the society against people who were called so-called Black people. So what Marcus Garvey proposed was this Back to Africa movement in which Blacks would return back to Africa. Garvey was associated with Liberia and the founding of Liberia, etc., as a place for Blacks to go and settle outside of, and throughout American history and other places, the American racial order have identified several places for Blacks to return to outside of America. For example, in the 1860s, following the Haitian Revolution, Haiti was deemed a place where Abraham Lincoln appointed Frederick Douglass as ambassador to Haiti to look into expatriating Black Americans to the island. And many Black Americans did immigrate to the island of Haiti post the 1860s. Anyway, so against that, W.E.B. Du Bois proposed against Marcus Garvey's Black nationalism this emphasis on Black integration in American society. And in his attack on Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois would come to be a co-founder of what's called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the whole emphasis against Marcus Garvey was to find a means to develop a Black politics that would focus on integrating Blacks into the society, as opposed to a Black nationalist politics that looked to Africa or a Pan-African, because Marcus Garvey's movement was a Pan-African movement, but he argued all Black folks should look to Africa as their place of refuge, as opposed to looking to integrate and assimilate in societies dominated by white folks. So against Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois would propose Black assimilationism and Black integration. Now, and not only was that against Garvey, but that was also against another nemesis of his called Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington promoted a Black politics based on segregation and and economic segregation. I'm sorry, political and social segregation, and economic integration in the American nation state. So what Booker T. Washington argued was that, and he gives a famous speech in which he argues that what Blacks need to focus on is agricultural and mechanical education, in which they would strive economically and not see social and political integration within the dominant society. And W.E.B. Du Bois would reject that in favor of course, higher education, because Booker T. Washington did not emphasize higher education, but instead focused on agricultural and industrial education for Black folks. And Du Bois is also calling for a politics of integration and assimilation. So against Booker T. Washington and against Marcus Garvey, he is fighting against a politics of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, and he is also fighting against a politics of Black segregation in favor of a politics of integration and assimilation. It's interesting because by the time of his death, W.E.B. Du Bois would promote Pan-Africanism and politics of segregation, which is why he would move to Ghana at the end of his life. He dies in Ghana in 1963. So by the time he reaches that phase, he realizes, and he dies on the eve of the March on Washington, led by A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King. So he would go from denouncing the politics of Pan-Africanism, a politics of economic segregation, in favor of assimilation and integration. And by the time of his death, he would adopt both Garvey and Booker T. Washington's position. And this is strange because within the sociology of race, you get this divide between those who favor whether a politics of against the genocidal practices of white institutions. You would get those who favor segregation. You would get those who favor a Black nationalism. You would get those who favor a Pan-Africanism, which looks to Black folks organizing and emphasizing Africa as the center of their politicking and their economic organization. And then you would also get those who favor assimilationism and integration. Some will argue MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., favored assimilation and integration. But if you ever read his speech that he gives prior to his death, he argues that he felt that he was integrating his people into a burning house. And then you have those who think Malcolm X favored a Pan-African nationalism against the genocidal effect of racial conflict in society. And this is also tied into the fourth component of the sociology of race, which is the racial resistance. So we have racial identity, racial formations, racial politics, and racial resistance. Those four categories constitute how we conceptualize the sociology of race. And racial resistance is connected to racial politics in the sense that the racial politics that anyone holds will determine how you resist racial conflict within the society. So if you hold on to a politic of assimilationism and integration, of course, your form of racial resistance will be organizing to integrate within the society, to deal with the prejudice, the racial animus, the discriminatory effects of the society. It is within those contexts that you will get different manifestations to understand why is it in our attempt to integrate and assimilate within Western society, you get backlash from whites. And there are several theories that attempt to explain that. For example, you have scapegoating theory that says, the issues of the society are displaced onto Blacks, and this leads to racial animus and racial prejudice, and this is what prevents Blacks from integrating or assimilating in the society. You get authoritarian personality, which argues the reason why Blacks could or cannot integrate in society is because the society is an authoritarian. The majority of those, and this comes out of Frankfurt School, Theodore Adorno and Horkheimer, and they try to understand the rise of fascism and how fascism emerges among Europeans, and how this fascism leads to racial prejudice, lynchings, etc. And then you also have what's called distance scale theory, in which we argue the distance between different racial groups as a result of racial segregation prevents any interaction between the groups, and this leads to discriminatory effects or stereotypes about the groups that prevents Blacks from integrating in the society. So your racial politics determines basically what form of resistance. that the racial group will exercise in the society. So if you're pushing, for example, a Pan-African racial politics, as Malcolm X and many others attempted to do in the 60s and the 70s, including the Black Panther Party movement. And this I know I use a lot of examples from America, but this also applied to the diaspora as well. There were brothers and sisters in the diaspora who were pushing for a Pan-African position for Blacks to not seek integration and assimilation in the society, but on the contrary, to push for centering Africa and uniting Black folks to repatriate back to Africa and help Africa develop its politics, its economic, and its social institutions. And if you emphasize politics of Black nationalism, which some will argue the Black Panthers did, which they not so, they were more of a political economic group than they were a Black nationalist group in a sense, because they sought solidarity through the Third World Movement of the 1960s and 70s as well. So it was less an emphasis on Black nationalism and more so an emphasis on the class structure. Now, that's very important because in the sociology of race, what would emerge is, and this emerges within, this starts as an attack against W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of the attempt to understand Black racial identity. Whether or not, if you understand race as not a biological and immutable construct, and in this place, it's instead a social constructivist concept. The problem becomes then, what is the origins of Black praxis in Western society or societies based on race? Well, people like E. Franklin Frazier and William Julius Wilson, who build off of the sociology of E. Franklin Frazier, would argue within the sociology of race that the emphasis should no longer be race, since race is not a biological and immutable construct, but is instead a social construct. The distinctions between Blacks and whites, being that they're social constructivists, the emphasis should be on class and not race. In fact, William Julius Wilson's famous work is The Declining Significance of Race, because building on E. Franklin Frazier, what would happen is that the racial identity of Black folk would start to assume white praxis, white bourgeois praxis. So there became a divide in all Black, even under segregation, of Blacks between the praxis associated with poor Blacks and the praxis associated with bourgeois Blacks. So E. Franklin Frazier was one of the first scholars to start to focus on the declining significance in race in favor of looking at how class would impact the racial identity of Black folk and what Black folks would what politics Black people would assume. Of course, if you focused on class, the more bourgeois you were, the more likely you were to seek assimilation and integration in the society. The less bourgeois you were, the more likely you were to seek segregation. And we can see that clearly in the two philosophies of, let's say, MLK and Malcolm X. Malcolm X comes from a poor background. His father was part of the whole Garveyite movement of the 1920s. So Malcolm, when he joins the Nation of Islam, he not only emphasized the Black nationalism and Black Pan-Africanism, but because of his poverty and upbringing, he also focused on Black segregation and economic uplift. Now you take the more middle-class MLK, his emphasis becomes not Black nationalism, Black Pan-Africanism, Black segregation. Instead, it becomes assimilatory. It becomes integration, because once again, the emphasis becomes not separating us, but let's look at what unites us in economic opportunity. So equality of opportunity, recognition, and distribution becomes the focus of those who are seeking integration. Now, this is very important because when we get to the late 20th and 21st century, within the sociology of race, these same debates exist today. You have your English compatriots, such as Paul Gilroy, for example, who wrote the book Black Modernity. People like Cornel West in his book Race Matters. They're dealing with these four components of the sociology of race, and they're coming up with the same conclusions, for example. Now, the two dominant theories that would emerge in the late 20th and 21st century are one, critical race theory, and the second is Afro-pessimism that would emerge out of this debate of racial identity, racial formations, and racial politics and racial resistance. And I'll briefly describe the two and how where Paul Gilroy, Cornel West, Patricia Hill Collins, and Wilderson, and all of these other Afro-pessimists, where they fall in within these debates. So critical race theory, and Frantz Fanon, that's another very important person when it comes, because what would emerge in the sociology of race is two strands. On the one hand, you have what we call the Du Boisian focus on assimilation and integration, not the later Du Bois who would focus on Pan-Africanism, because there's a movement from the ideals of the later movement. Post the 1960s, post the civil rights movement in America, there are two strands that would develop within the sociology of race regarding racial identity, racial formation, racial politics, and racial resistance. And the two strands are what we call critical race theory and Afro-pessimism. And intersectionality will fall within those two strands as well. And those two strands will build on the early works of W.E.B. Du Bois's movement towards assimilation and integration within Western society. And then the Fanonian position. Frantz Fanon was a psychologist from Martinique who wrote two great books. He has other essays, but his two main books are Black Skin, White Mass, and The Wretched of the Earth. And Fanon is trying to understand, and Fanon is writing during the era of Du Bois, however you want to pronounce it, in the 1940s, early 30s. He dies at a young age. Black Skin, White Mass, and The Wretched of the Earth. In those two works, he's trying to understand what happens to the racial identity of Black folks as they integrate or are segregated in Western society. And he argues, as he comes to the same conclusion as E. Franklin Frazier, is this whitening of Black people, and this is the argument he makes in Black Skin, White Mass, who assume the racial identity of white folks amongst the discriminatory effects of Western society. And in The Wretched of the Earth, he's looking at how should Africa organize itself post-independence and coming out of slavery and colonialism, and how should African societies constitute their society? Should there be capitalist? Should they be communist, etc.? So that's what Frantz Fanon is looking at. So what would emerge post the Du Bois era, the Fanon era, which takes us to the late 20th century and the 21st century. And what we have is critical race theory, which builds on, and I know you all are familiar with the debates in the West, especially in America, on critical race theory. Anyway, critical race theory focuses on the work of the early Du Bois on this notion of assimilation and integration. However, the focus is on what was called institutional and structural racism in Western society, and how these institutional and structural racist practices prevent Blacks from integrating and fully assimilating into the society. Now, it comes out of critical legal theory, and it's an attempt to synthesize critical legal theory with the negative dialectic of the Frankfurt School. I don't know if you all are familiar with what negative dialectic is. The Frankfurt School were a group of German theorists who they're in a sense, they're Hegelians. They're looking at the constitution of society, not from the material base as Marx attempted to do, but they looked at the constitution of society from the structural. Because remember, Marx argued that material relations determine the ideological superstructure, and the ideological superstructure in turn reinforces the material relations in society. So the Frankfurt School will look at the how culture reinforces the material relations of society. So they look at, for example, one structural Marxist, although he's not a Frankfurt School, but we consider him a structural Marxist, or who emphasizes negative dialectics. And by negative dialectics, what they meant was, in order to rid society of negative aspects or dysfunctional aspects, excuse me, social actors must think against the praxis of must weigh and think against the praxis of the society, and in order to convict the society of not being in line with its ideas, ideals, and values. So to convict the society of not exercising its ideals as it pertains to Black folk. So when Black people utilize critical race theory, what they're saying is there are institutional practices that are put in place that prevents America from fulfilling its ideas and ideals and values because of the discriminatory effects that prevent Black people from assimilating into the society. I'm gonna give you an example. I know that could be theoretical. So for example, in contemporary America, we have majority of young Black people will go to school in segregated schools. Now, why is that? There are laws. We no longer have laws on the books that say Blacks must go to school with Blacks. That was ended with Brown versus the Board of Education of 1954. So how is it that in 2023, 90% of most Black people will spend their entire lives from elementary school to high school in segregated Black schools, even though the laws are not in the books? Well, that's a product of institutional racism. What are some of the institutional racist practices that were put in place to prevent Black or to maintain Black folks in segregated communities? Well, one of the practices was redlining. There were certain communities that were put in place that Black people, they would draw maps that Blacks could not ascertain mortgages to purchase homes in those communities. The second were welfare laws that prevented Blacks from that made Blacks dependent on the social welfare system of the society that segregated them in certain communities. Well, these are institutional racist arrangements that prevented Black folks from assimilating in the society. And what critical race theory argues is that, well, we have to convict the society for not fulfilling its ideas and ideals and practices that prevents Black folks from completely assimilating into society. And how do we do that? Well, we have to continue to organize and protest and pass laws to desegregate these communities. So the attacks are on the institutions themselves. So you can see why white Americans are threatened by, to some extent, critical race theory, because they view this conviction of their institution as a personal attack on them themselves. So that's the great, and we would include Cornel West, Kimberly Crenshaw, all of we would include them as part of this critical race theory, because the emphasis is still on assimilation and integration in Western society, but the emphasis is not on personal racism or personal prejudices. The attack is on the institutions themselves that that do have discriminatory effects that linger till this day. The second strand that, and Paul Gilroy as well fall into this emphasis on Black modernity. The problem is we'll get to that when I give my critique. But anyway, let me finish. So the second component is Afro-pessimism. And what is Afro-pessimism? And it's a bunch of foolishness too. But anyway, Afro-pessimism argues that the ontological category, I'm gonna define ontological. Ontological is just the study of being, what is there in the material world. So Black is an ontological category. Now, do they emphasize Blackness as being biological and immutable? No, what they do, what Afro-pessimists do, they adopt postmodernism and post-structuralism into the discourse of racial identity formation. Now, how do they do that? And let me give you a quick background on postmodernism and post-structuralism. Postmodernism and post-structuralism are concepts that are theories in philosophy which would emerge in the late 80s, and it's an attack on the Cartesian ego, for example. It's on an attack on the rational person, because for the postmodernists and post-structuralists, they emphasize what's called the decentered subject. So the subject can never fully be rational. So there's an attack on the rational subject in favor of a decentered subject that is able to defer meaning and ego-centered communicative discourse. Now, postmodernism and post-structuralism in the social sciences, as well as the sociology of race, is an attempt to deal with this issue of racial agency and social agency against structural determining factors. So you emphasize conflict theory or material relations of production, when you emphasize societal institutions as the basis upon which society is constituted, there's this negation of the social actor as a rational agent, or as an agent who is able to constitute and construct their own meaning and understanding. So postmodernism and post-structuralism is an attempt to deal with that issue, and they attempt to deal with that issue by emphasizing the decentered subject and floating signifiers. So there's no one-to-one correlation between the signifier and the signified, and you look at it from a linguistic perspective. Anyway, Afro-pessimism attempts to apply those concepts into, which emerges out of the 80s with the work of Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and many other theorists. What they attempt to do is, and many Afro-pessimists, is use that to emphasize Blackness as an ontological category that is tantamount to social death, so that Blackness can never ever fully, the so-called Black people can never fully define themselves for themselves, because the category is an ontological category that is equated with social death and violence. The Western society is based on using this category to marginalize and prevent Black people from ever integrating into the society. So for Afro-pessimists, all of these theories that we're looking at, intersectionality, LGBTQ, all that, all of these theories use Blackness as a means to an end, but Blackness itself can never truly define what it means to be Black in the society, because it's just a category used by different groups for their own agendas. So the intersectional people use Blackness to identify Black, queer, disabled person, but Blackness in and of itself is never able to define itself for itself. So therefore, we're left, Black people, quote unquote, Black people are left as simply a category for social death in the society. So these are the two strands within the sociology of race that have emerged post Du Bois, post Fanon, and there is a move away from the class factor. And I'm going to conclude with my own position, and then we'll get to the questions and answers. I don't want to over talk. Anyway, so for me, there is there is an attempt in my work to criticize both the critical race component and the Afro-pessimist component by building on two things. First, the social constructivist nature of Black racial identity within the sociology of race. So let's remove biological factors as the basis, which Du Bois attempts to do and Fanon attempts to do as the basis of understanding racial identity. And for me, the emphasis should be on class. Now, I agree with critical race theorists such as Paul Gilroy that Black people, I agree with this concept of Black modernity and the Black Atlantic, in the sense that Blacks have been assimilated in the society. There is no such thing as, especially among the American Black, there is no such thing as Black consciousness. And this is where, if you read my work, I attempt to understand the ontological origins of consciousness from quantum mechanics. Because in order for me to develop my theory, I had to negate the biological and immutable factor of understanding Black racial formation and racial identity within the sociology of race. So I do not accept the position that there is a Black consciousness the way Paul Gilroy and Cornel West defines it. Why? Because Cornel West and Paul Gilroy return back to a biological and immutable understanding of race that Du Bois and Fanon is trying to refute. When you read the works of Gilroy and Cornel West, what you find is they try to define Black consciousness along the lines of the adaptive vitality school by not focusing on race as biological. The move now is looking at race as looking at Black consciousness as grounded in Black improvisation, Black musical style. So that becomes immutable. So for Gilroy and Cornel West, there is a thing such as Black consciousness is represented by our conception of time. You all have heard the Black people are always late, colored people time. That's because, you know, there's a Black improvisation. Our musical style, such as jazz, is different from classical music, because when you look at the work of Thelonious Monk, when you look at the work of Miles Davis, there's this Black improvisation. And I love Miles Davis. Miles Davis was good for getting on stage and improvising, Well, what Gilroy and Cornel West has done is take improvisation, our conception of time, the way we walk, and say, well, this is what Blackness is. So there's a return back to the whole biological understanding of race to define what Black is. Within that, they also want to say, well, Blackness is also Western, because we have been socialized in Western society. So they've reinterpreted double consciousness as an epistemological approach to understanding what it means to be Black. By that, they mean our improvisational style, our musical style, the way we walk, our conception of time. And at the same time, we are Western. We are our understanding of democracy, of equality. So therefore, we serve as the means to. We're a mirror image of what America is not, because Black folks are discriminated against because they're Black, while simultaneously trying to reproduce the American way of life. So for Paul Gilroy, they turned double consciousness into a new version where we want to hold on to what is Black about us, but have whiteness recognize that Blackness while treating us, while we fight for equality of opportunity, recognition, and distribution in the society. I have a problem with that, because for me, this nonsense, there's no such thing as Black improvisation is meaningless. You know, Fanon has a great critique of that in his book, Black Skin, White Mask, because Fanon attempts to do the same thing early on in his writings, because Fanon wants to reify what Blackness is, improvisation. Now, Blackness is defined by the larger society. And these concepts, as defined by the larger society, Fanon is arguing that we should embrace those concepts and that becomes Black consciousness. And from there, we should seek equality of opportunity, recognition, and distribution. There's no such thing as a Black practical consciousness. We are Western. Black people in the diaspora are Western in their views of the world, their ethos, their epistemology, etc. And I have a problem with Afro-pessimism. My problem with Afro-pessimism is the fact that, yes, they are correct to highlight the fact that Blackness is a social category created by whites. My problem with, now, does that mean there is no mechanism by which Blackness can define itself for itself? The Afro-pessimists, by looking at Blackness as a category that other groups use for their own agenda, to negate Blackness as its own sui generis category that is attempting to define itself for itself, for me, I agree. That has been the case. But that does not, for me, from my perspective, that does not negate the fact that Blackness has been able to define itself for itself. It solely chose assimilation and integration at the end of the day to define what the Black movement should eventually unfold as. And I'm going to use an example and end on this example. During the Haitian Revolution, the Haitian Revolution is the only successful revolution in recorded history. And it is a fight for of the African people on the island of what was then known as Hispaniola. So the Haitian Revolution takes place from 1791 to 1804, when Haiti is declared an independent nation state by its founding father, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, in 1804. Dessalines, when he constitutes Haiti as an independent nation state against white supremacy, against slavery, he is struggling between three economic systems. The economic system of the Africans, but it's called the Lakou system in Haiti. I call the voodoo ethic in the spirit of communism. Jean Casimir calls it the counter plantation system. And then that system was juxtaposed against the mercantilist and liberal system of the mulatto elites and the petty bourgeois blacks of the island. And Dessalines was considered a petty bourgeois black. But when he's attempting to constitute Haiti as an independent nation state, he writes the 1805 Constitution of Haiti, in which he attempts to define what a black nation state would look like. So there has been that attempt to define blackness as a category, not only as an ontological category, but an ontological category that is for itself, to use the Marxian term, against one that is in itself, which stands against which is used as an agenda for other groups. And in that attempt, he defines anyone who, in the 1805 Constitution, Dessalines designate everyone as black. There were Polish soldiers who fought with the Africans during the Haitian Revolution, and he allowed them to remain on the island, but they had to identify as black. So it was white people identifying as black. So it was an attempt to define what black racial identity in terms of its social, political, and economic components. He attempts to synthesize the Lakou system of the Africans, because the Africans were against mercantilist and liberal capitalism. They felt it was exploitative. Remember, slavery and segregation was a justification. Racial segregation was a justification for the economic system emerging at the time, liberal and mercantilist capitalism. So there is that attempt, and what is occurring now, the Afro-pessimists are correct to point out that attempt now is no longer a sui generis attempt by so-called black people to define what blackness is. On the contrary, it's an agenda used by other groups to define, to utilize blackness as an agent or an agenda for their own intersectional LGBTQ agenda. So the Afro-pessimists are correct to point that out now, but that doesn't negate the fact there was an attempt to do so, and there can still be an attempt to do so if the emphasis is of black people is a Pan-African emphasis that seeks to unite black people in the diaspora on the continent and redefine the social, political, and economic processes of what it means black. But if the sole emphasis becomes assimilatory and integrationist, then you end up with black people who are white supremacists. You end up with people like Lloyd Austin, Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, who are basically white supremacists. They exercise a fascistic practice that's associated with white supremacy. When you get an Obama that would attack someone like a country like Libya in Africa, Obama is a descendant of slaves, yet he's done the same thing as white supremacists have done, attack Libya for the benefit of white supremacy, which becomes problematic. And these are the problems that we're dealing with in the sociology of race. It's this continuous attempt to define black racial identity, black racial formation, black politics, and black resistance to white supremacy, to even even as the Afro-pessimists point out, the agenda of other groups such as LGBTQ, et cetera. Because in contemporary America, black folks have become the poster children for intersectionality, for everything queer. We have commercials on TV, everything queer is black. everything transgender is Black. They want to present a Black face on this new neoliberal emphasis on identity politics. And I will end on that.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Should be. I have said a lot there.
Yeah, I'll let them take a moment to digest, but we do thank you so much for your time and all that you shared with us, Dr. McCoy. You got a double thumbs up here that you can't see, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
Anyone have a question about the reading maybe that you came prepared with while you take some time to think about the lecture?
Don't be shy. Come on.
Yes, there's a question here. Do you mind being on camera, Ellie? Yeah. Okay. Do you want me to stay here? Can you hear me from here? Dr. McCoy,
Oh, I can hear you.
Ellie?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Okay. So after I finished the readings for this week, I'm someone who there's a lot of terminology in this text, and so I hunted down on YouTube. You did a podcast like 2 years ago, almost, which I listened through, which was really helpful, I think, in understanding these readings. And my question kind of brings in the topic of today, but something that you mentioned in the podcast. I'm using critical race theory in my dissertation, and in the podcast you mentioned being critical of Crenshaw's ideas of intersectionality. And I was just wondering if you could expand more on that, because I think that's something that's not as commonly talked about, and I would just like to hear more about your perspective in that situation.
Okay. So intersectionality highlights the fact that there are serial identities upon which the individual, that constitutes the individual. So your age, your sex, your global position, your sexual orientation, and these positions within the dominant social structure have their own biases and are discriminated against differently. And so therefore, a Black heterosexual woman would have a different experience from, let's say, a white lesbian a woman who is middle class. So therefore, these serial identities, which are nothing but standpoint theory, somehow represent a different epistemological perspective to the nature of reality as such. So my critique on intersectionality is epistemological. And what that means is, an epistemology deals with how we know what we know and how can we come to know what we know. So the question I raise against intersectionality is, does my age, my sexual orientation, my class position, my racial identity, does that offer me an insight into the nature of reality as such? Or are they simply political categories that are used to fight for equality of opportunity and recognition and distribution? So what I argue is that they're political categories and not epistemological categories. Now that's very important, because epistemologically, being a woman, being a man can't tell you nothing about the nature of reality as such. Well, in contemporary America, they will tell you, if you believe 2 + 2 is 5, I have to accept the fact that 2 + 2 is 5. Well, epistemologically, I have a problem with that, because unlike postmodernists and post-structuralists, I do believe in one universal truth. I do believe that we can ascertain the nature of reality as such, and my race, my class, and my sexual orientation does not offer me any insight into that nature of reality as such, period. So yes, they're political categories created by the dominant social structure, but the the oppression that emerges is the same oppression. For example, in gender studies, they have the same concept as we find in the sociology of race. W.E.B. Du Bois has a concept called double consciousness. In gender studies, they have bifurcated consciousness. What it means is when you're an oppressed group, you develop a bifurcated consciousness. Your consciousness is split because you're oppressed while simultaneously you want to recursively reorganize and reproduce those same ideals in order to be successful while simultaneously experiencing the discriminatory effects of the society. Okay, cool. So what? But the problem at the end becomes both groups seek the same thing: integration and assimilation and equality of opportunity and recognition and distribution. And when they do get there, the understanding was in gender studies was somehow women, because they are women, and this represents the gender difference theory in gender studies, that somehow women have a different approach to sexuality, a different approach to war. Well, I don't want to surprise anyone, but Victoria Nuland, Hillary Clinton, Angela Merkel, all of them are warmongering feminine men. They exercise the same patriarchy as a man, just like Barack Obama is no different from Bill Clinton. He exercised the same white supremacy and patriarchy of the society. Hillary Clinton, the theory in gender studies where women were supposed to be less warmongering. Well, I have news for you. Margaret Thatcher was a warmonger, and she was a woman. So how is it that their gender identity somehow is supposed to give them different insight? Nonsense. That's foolishness. So epistemologically, I disagree with intersectional theory. Yeah, I do see the political viability. Okay, cool. We all want to integrate. So what?
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McCombs. Thanks for your question, Ellie. Go ahead, Marianne.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Hi, Dr. McComb. Thank you again for your talk. I was wondering about, you were talking about segregation, about housing and how some schools are still very segregated and communities as well. I was wondering what were your thoughts on voluntary segregation and whether this also benefits the whiteness or if that's just also a way of keeping your own culture, you know, the comfort of having people that are like similar to you, near you, where you stand with that.
When you say voluntary segregation in terms of class or race position?
I guess in this case would be race and ethnicity.
That's a wonderful question. My perspective on the matter is I do believe that slavery and de jure segregation, as the segregation by law, attempted to force Black people to see the world through their racial identity. And this was to justify the economic system put in place from the beginning of the 17th century all the way up until the Haitian Revolution towards the end of the 18th century. As a result of that, there was a push among Black people to try to constitute society based on their racial identity, but they encountered problems in terms of forming solidarity with other Black folks in the diaspora on the African continent. It became problematic with forming solidarity with other groups. For example, during the Haitian Revolution, there was a move by the mulatto elites, not so much to focus on Blackness as a social category to organize society, but to focus on what was called secular humanism, the human nature of all people. And so therefore, many of the mulatto elites, as well as some of the petty bourgeois Blacks, they attempted to foment different revolutionary movements in Latin America, in Europe, and to form solidarity with other groups in Russia, etc. And for me, that is, they got it right. Dessalines attempted to do that. There's a need. Yes, there is on the one hand a need for us, people, so-called Black people, to form solidarity with Blacks in the diaspora and on the African continent, but that shouldn't be done at the expense of solidarity among other groups. And the only way we can do that is if we get away from this biological notion of race and look at how class came to categorize us and pin Black people against each other. Because who would have thought that the first so-called Black president of America would undermine the most successful Black country on the African continent? That seems very problematic to me. But when you focus, or for example, in contemporary Black America, during Black History Month, which is held in February, we want to celebrate people like Kamala Harris, Lloyd Austin. These are people who are supporting, for example, a corrupt neo-Nazi and fascist state like Ukraine. How is it people who experience slavery would in turn support a country that praises Stefan Bandera, who was a neo-Nazi who would have lynched these same Black people who are supporting Ukraine, which is a corrupt neo-Nazi and fascist state? That doesn't make any sense. But during Black History Month, they want Black people to focus with skin color at the expense of material praxis. So to that, yes, I do see a need for Black folks to take the experiences that we gathered from slavery, help Africa develop, help Black countries develop, but not at the expense of the solidarity and struggles we have with other people who are being oppressed and exploited in the society. So that's my answer.
All right, thank you.
Did I answer your question?
I think so.
So
I don't
it's not voluntary. I don't support voluntary segregation at the expense of social solidarity with other groups. What I support is material development for the Black diaspora with the assistance of other groups who we share a human experience with, exploited and oppressed other groups who we share experiences with. So this move away from race and more, yes.
Just to follow up then, because you asked me if it was voluntary segregation on race or class, then in that case, class would be a totally different idea because when it comes into the material.
Yes, because my attempt is to move away from the class-based society. I'm still a materialist at heart. I'm still a materialist at heart, and the emphasis should be, as to quote William Julius, the title of William Julius Wilson's book, the emphasis should be on the decline and significance of not only race but class as well. So that's my emphasis.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead. Would you like to come over here so you're more likely to be heard, or do you want to try speaking? We'll see how it goes. Yeah, I think if you just try to come around, yeah? If you just hang a left here, Chris will let you through. Thank you. So we've got another question for you. Come on down. Okay, excellent.
You spoke a lot about
Dr. McComb, can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
you spoke a lot about moving away from the biological notion of race. Do you think that is likely or possible to happen in today's society? Is that something that you feel like is on the horizon, or do you think it will take a lot longer for the majority of society to move away from the accepted biological conception of race?
I think in contemporary society, there's a move to reify. In fact, it's getting worse. It's as though we're going back in time because of this notion of the neoliberal notion on identity politics. There's this reification of race that has taken place. So now what we find in the neoliberal order is this celebration, this narcissistic celebration of the self and racial identity as reified categories by which we define ourselves. So now the emphasis becomes identifying myself, my individual self, as a quote unquote Black person who is queer. Well, I'm not queer, but a Black person that is queer, that is disabled, and celebrate those categories. So now what's happening, race is being reified once again as a category, and this is where the Afro-pessimists get it right. So race is being reified as categories that we can apply different agendas onto. So now if I want to form solidarity, I want to form solidarity with a queer, a transgender, and while simultaneously maintaining my Blackness, which is now defined by me having natural hair, my conception of time, my improvisational style. So no, there is, I think it's getting worse with identity politics. So instead of focusing, because if we truly understand what the postmodernists and post-structuralists are saying, if we truly put race under erasure, and this is important because Jean-Paul Sartre, which is the French philosopher, existential philosopher, in his critique of Fanon, because Fanon attempted to reify Blackness as defined by white people in order to make Blackness an ontological category by which we can celebrate and then exercise our free will in a white supremacist world. Jean-Paul Sartre is critiquing that and say, well, if you embrace that, you're embracing the white supremacy, the white supremacist basis upon which Blackness was defined for you to start with. And that's what we're seeing happening now. We're reaffirming Blackness as a category as it was defined by white people. So therefore, Blacks were lazy, Blacks were always late, Blacks have an improvisational nature to everything in life, blah, 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 etc. And we're embracing that and say, well, that's my Blackness. I can attach my identity to it, and everyone else has to recognize that. So for me, under the neoliberal processes of identity politics, is getting worse. We're not moving away from this biological notion and immutable notion of race. We're just reifying it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, I think that is
That's
everyone.
it. Come on now, people. I've said a lot.
Anyone else? Did I see a hand? No?
There's so much going on in the world. You all should, this is the time to be engaged and understand what's happening. Because what's interesting, and you all making me speak, and I don't want to do that, but what's interesting is the fact that what we're seeing, if you understand everything I've just said, what we're seeing now, and I'm going to use the case of Russia, is this move away from Russia as being a part, because remember, as a result of racial formations in the economic system that reified Blackness as a distinct category, what emerged from that was the construction of whiteness as a racial category. And in America, unlike Europe, where you had different ethnic groups, the Poles, the Irish, etc., that were ethnic in Europe, when they arrived to America, because of racial segregation and racial prejudice in American society, those groups were able to define themselves as white against blacks. So therefore, the Poles became white, whereas in Europe, they were not. The Russians, when they arrived to America, became white. The Scots-Irish became white. In fact, in the Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois highlight the fact that because Du Bois was born in 1868, 3 years after the American Civil War. And what he realized and he grew up in the North, Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which is the northern part of the country. But he realized that when he moved to the South to work at Tuskegee and West Virginia State University, what he realized is that Black folk in the North had a higher social status than the Scots-Irish, who were considered dogs, who weren't, because they were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, could not integrate white society. But over time, they became white and they became superior to Black folks, whereas early on, because of the discriminatory effects they experienced in Europe, when they arrived to America, especially during the Great Migration of Irish people because of the potato famine in Ireland, when they arrived to America, they became white. They were treated lower than Blacks, and over time they became white. But what we're witnessing contemporarily, and we saw this during 9/11 too with the Arabs, but now there's this move to de-white the Russians. In America, universities are banning Russian texts. Even in Europe, the Anglo-Saxons are banning Russian texts. They're removing Russians from the quote unquote whiteness category. Russians are being discriminated against in the West. And so now Black folks are even higher than the Russians. And in doing so, we're seeing how a group becomes a social category. They don't want you to teach Dostoevsky. Are you insane? This is ridiculous. And many people are afraid to say anything about this. And you would think Black people in America, because of the experiences that they had in segregation, under slavery, would be the ones who would speak out and speak up against these processes, but they're not. You would assume it is Africans on the continent, because Russia never practiced colonialism. It is Africans on the continent who are emerging and speaking up against what's happening to the deracialization of the Russian identity. So what is it about the experiences of Black folk in America that is preventing them from seeing what is happening to the Russians and speaking out against it, while simultaneously practicing fascism and racism against the Russians, which Karine Jean-Pierre, Kamala Harris, Lloyd Austin, Susan Rice? You would think, as Black folks who have had this experience that we are now extrapolating onto the Russians, you would assume these people would stand firm and say, no, this is problematic, but they're not. They're the biggest warmongers and biggest fascists against what's happening. So this is where you have to become critical. This is where we have to look at the analysis and say, no. What happened in the diaspora? What happened in Black America that now Obama is the exploiter, is the representative of white supremacy on the African continent? So this is where you all have to become critical to understand within the sociology of race, to understand what is happening, how these categories become social constructive. Oh, now we have questions.
Yes, Deanna, go ahead. Would you mind coming a little closer? Just to make sure Dr. McComb can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, it's just recently I read a text that was about the white gaze. That was the title of the text. And I was wondering if there's studies about the vulnerability to speak about race and why, and especially in relation to societies where race become a taboo. And this white gaze that it's usually the vulnerable to speak about these subjects. Obviously, also when experiencing racism, but also the ones that never experience racism are against speaking about this or with vulnerability to speak about these subjects.
That's a great question. And this is where it becomes, and this is where William Julius Wilson's work is so important, because when we look at the economic interests involved in speaking up and speaking out against racism, many people are afraid. For example, we have, and I'm going to use a literal example, we have what's called the squad in American politics. These are a group of Black women who claim to be anti-war, who are the spokespersons for identity politics in America. Ilhan Omar, who's Sudanese, and numerous others. There's a Hispanic sister in the group. And when this whole Russian debacle came out, they came out with a letter in support, initially denouncing the U.S. backing of Ukraine as a corrupt neo-Nazi and fascist state. And they immediately recanted on the letter. And this was over the summer because of the pressure that was placed on them by the powers that be. So the economic interest has served as a hindrance. And when we say economic interest, this push for equality of opportunity, recognition, and distribution by the Black other and LGBTQ other serves as a hindrance from speaking out against the discriminatory effects of modernity itself. Because grounded in the Constitution of ingrained in the Constitution of modernity, and by modernity we mean the Western push coming out of the Enlightenment project to constitute the individual as rational individual, was done at the expense of people of color and many other people, Blacks especially, the Native Americans in America. And this new push now for integration of the other has served as economic hindrance to prevent them from speaking out when we see the discriminatory effects of modernity and the processes that comes out of the discriminatory effects. So it's likely that those who are not economically invested in the system, in modernity, are more likely to speak out and speak up to the continuous discriminatory effects and oppression and exploitation of modernity and those who claim to be modern, secular, and humanist.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's offer some final applause for Dr. McComb.
I think the sister right there had a question. The
Thank you so
sister,
much.
what is your name?
Kimberly,
She had a
hello.
question.
Oh, sorry, someone else has a question? Sure, but you folks are also due a break, so.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry.
So you're fine to ask the question, just letting you know to keep in mind perhaps the duration of the question.
Well, mine's really short. You guys. Okay.
Yeah, all right.
All right. So you were talking about how like how the treatment of how they're treating Russians against like the war, and then how
like Black people should be maybe the first ones to like respond and support. Do you think that has to do with, you know, the idea of what is it, like race as an objective condition, so that it has kind of been accepted? So in that sense, maybe I'm kind of putting like words in their mouths, 'cause I can't speak on that, but that they're choosing maybe to see more of like the color of like Russians being as white, so supporting it is not really supporting the experience, but supporting them as like how they look like, because they've been treated that way for being Black. If that makes sense? Yeah.
The assumption would be, regardless of the color of the person's skin or whatever, because of the experiences that Black folks in America and the diaspora have experienced, that you would assume, had they moved away from this biological and immutable notion of race, which is now reified under postmodernism and post-structuralism and identity politics, you would assume that it would have insight into the discriminatory effects of modernity. And this is raised by Cornel West and Paul Gilroy when they reconceived W.E.B. Du Bois' notion of a double consciousness as an epistemological term that gives Black people an insight into the discriminatory effects of modernity, but they don't. They, in turn, some Black folks were the first people to put up the Ukrainian flags, and they can't even identify Ukraine on a map. They can't even spell Ukraine, but yet they went along with everything that the powers that be, the media, military, industrial complex was telling them to do. They went along with it. And when you take nations such as South Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, and other nations in West Africa who decided to remain neutral and not critique Russia because they highlight the fact that the Russians never participated in colonialism. And South Africa owes its national boundaries and borders to Russia, because when America was backing the apartheid regime in South Africa, supporting it, the apartheid regime, and supporting their push into Angola, it was the Cubans and the Russians who came to the rescue of the South Africans. It is the Cubans and the Russians who supported its fight against the apartheid system on the continent. And this is why many of the Black nations on the continent, as well as in the Caribbean, have stood by Russia or chose to remain neutral. Whereas when you take Black people in America, something happened. There's a disconnect here. Why is it that you're not at the forefront? And I'm not saying all Black folks, but the majority. And the majority that are the power elites, the Obamas, the Susan Rice, the Condoleezza Rice. This is absurd. But, you know, this is why understanding the critique of the sociology of race is so important, to see the dynamics of why, you know, different Black folks will take a stand and others will not. This is where this move from a biological and immutable notion of race is so important.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, I was going to say to you, I don't know whether you can hear me, everybody. I hope you can.
Yes, I can.
We can all hear
Okay,
you.
so just saying, as always, a fantastic insight, political, philosophical insight into race, which is good for everybody to understand. So everybody's already given you applause. I'd give you another applause as well. Thank you so much for doing this. The students do need to have a break. The conversation could go on, but they need to have a break. And I will be in touch with you again, Paul. I will write to you, say thank you again, and I'll speak to you soon. But thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Not a problem. I really enjoyed it.